Hi, I'm Chris Mushler, VCDX257 from virtualelephant.com. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to take two Azure AKS clusters in different availability zones and connect them together leveraging the Cilium CNI cluster mesh technology. Let's get started. All right, so we're going to dive right into it. I don't have any resources yet created inside of my Azure environment other than for a Bootstrap server. So we'll switch over to the Bootstrap server where we're going to execute all of the commands to create the networks that we need, peer them together with one another, as well as then deploying our AKS clusters. All right, this is my Ubuntu server that I already have running inside of Azure. It's already pre-configured with the Azure CLI, the Cilium CLI, as well as the Hubble CLI and kubectl. All right, so we're going to create the resource groups using the CLI. AZ group, create, give it a name that is descriptive, as well as the region. Going to create the second one for West. And once those resource groups are set up, we can create our first virtual network for the East availability zone. So this is leveraging, again, the Azure CLI. I've pre-prepared the command here. So we're just going to go ahead and create it. And then once it's created, we're going to go ahead and export out the VNet ID that we need for the AKS creation command. So again, have it pre-popped. Go ahead and run it real fast. All right, so those two are created. And now we're ready to create our first AKS cluster inside of US East. So again, leveraging the CLI, we're going to go ahead and just create it. And this will just go ahead and run for several minutes within our environment. The first cluster has been created, so now we're going to go back to the Bootstrap server, execute those three commands, but this time for our second availability zone in US West 2, and then create the AKS cluster. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is actually create the virtual network for US West 2. And I've pre-populated the commands once again, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy them and then paste them onto my Bootstrap server. Give them a quick once over, it looks good. So it will create the virtual network for us within Azure. Now that that's done, we'll get the environment variable set up for when we create the AKS cluster in just a moment. And now we will create the AKS cluster. So we'll watch it get started here, and then we're just going to let it run in the background. All right, the second cluster is now deployed inside of AKS. So we have one cluster in US East, and then we have one cluster in US West 2. And now what we want to do is actually configure the Cilium CNI on both clusters to allow us to enable the cluster mesh technology. All right, now that our networks are set up, one of the things we need to do is actually peer the two together so that the cluster mesh will work across them. So we're going to go back here to my Azure portal. Now, while you can also do this through the Azure CLI, I like doing this part through the Azure portal just because I'm more visual. So you go ahead and click on our first one, which is US East. I'm going to come down here to pairings. We're going to add a peering. We're going to give it a peering link name, and we're going to call this peering East to West. We're going to allow access on the virtual network as well as allow traffic to the remote. The peering link name, this is going to be peering West to East. I'm going to select our virtual network from the bottom. Go ahead and click Add. Now we'll give this a moment to update. It's connected, so now we look at it. It has the virtual network ID for the remote network. You can see here US West. Okay, and if we come over here to US West, peerings, and we can see it is paired with US East. So just like that, our two networks are paired together, and this is going to allow us to actually enable the cluster mesh when we get to that part in a few minutes. All right, so we can see here in my Azure portal that both AKS clusters are installed. The next thing that we need to do before we can install the Cilium CNI on top of these clusters is to actually go through and get the kube config so we can connect to them. Now, if you remember from my previous video, what you can do is select one of the clusters and then go up here and click connect. And then it's going to show you a series of commands that you can run to go ahead and grab that kube config file. So we're going to go ahead and switch over to my Ubuntu server where we're going to execute these commands. All right, so what we're going to do is run the two commands to actually get the kube configs for these clusters and then install them in this Linux box under one kube config file. So now we've got both. We can look at it. You can see that we have all of the information for it. We can do a kubectl config get contexts. You can see that we're currently on the west, so we can do a kube config get nodes. We can see that we have the 3 node pools, and now we can switch contexts, kubectl config use context. We can do a kubectl get nodes, and we can see that we have 3 separate node pools. So we've got our 2 clusters set up. And if we look at the US East one right now and do a kubectl get pods -a, you can see that the core DNS service isn't running, and that when we look at the nodes themselves, they're showing as a status of not ready. So we need to install the Cilium CNI. And I've done this in earlier videos, but we're going to go ahead and show you how to do it really quickly here as well. So we're currently on the US East cluster. I've already added the Helm repo. If you haven't done that already, make sure you add the Helm repo for Cilium first. And what we are going to do here is copy. So this is for my US East. We're going to tell it to go ahead and install Cilium. We can do a watch kubectl get pods -a, and we can see the cluster coming online with the Cilium CNI. And we're going to go ahead and let this run for just a minute. All right, you can see here that everything's running. So we'll hit Control-C. We'll do a Cilium status. This is going to show us the status of the US East Azure cluster that we have in AKS. And you can see that Cilium says OK, operator says OK. So now we're going to switch contexts over to our US West data center, AKS cluster, AKS C1, US West. Okay, and just make sure we're on the right one. We'll go ahead and do a get pods -a. You can see this one is waiting. So we're going to go ahead and now we'll run our command to install Cilium inside of this cluster as well. So again, I've pre-popped the things for the command, so we'll go ahead and let it run. And we'll let this run for a moment while it starts up the CNI on all of the nodes. Now that Cilium is installed and set up on both AKS clusters in both West and East, we're ready to actually enable the service mesh. So right now we're currently on the West cluster, and we can check this by doing a kubectl config get contexts. We can see that we're on West, and so while we're here, we'll just quickly enable cluster mesh with Cilium cluster mesh enable service-type node port. Now we will switch context over to the US East cluster, and we'll run the same command. All right, that's done. So now if we do a Cilium status, we can see that the cluster mesh is enabled. So you'll remember from my previous video that I discovered that there's 2 variables that we need to make sure that are set and that are unique across the 2 clusters. The first is the cluster ID, the second is the cluster name. Now, when we enabled Cilium a few moments ago, we actually gave it a cluster ID, but one of the bugs, I think I would call it a bug, one of the bugs that I found when doing this was if you set that ID and the cluster name prior to enabling cluster mesh, it's actually resetting it back to 0 in default. So we're going to be explicit, and I'm going to show you how to set those two variables. So we're on the US East, so we're going to do a Cilium config set cluster ID. We're going to give it number 1, and then we're going to go Cilium config set cluster name, and we're going to call this one the cluster name of AKS C1 US East US. So now we've set that. So we'll switch our context back to the West cluster. Okay, and we'll run the 2 commands again, but this time for the second cluster. So we'll do cluster ID of 2, and then we'll do Cilium config set cluster name AKS. Cluster ID, cluster name are set. So now we're actually ready to configure the cluster mesh between the 2 environments. So you have to remember that you need the context. You're going to do this from one cluster, and you're going to execute the command just one. Now I'm treating the US East cluster as my primary cluster and the US West cluster as my secondary cluster. So we'll just make sure that we're on the right one. Cube control config, get contexts. Okay, we're on East. Okay, we've got the context name, so we'll do Cilium cluster mesh connect context AKS C1 US-East, and then destination context. Now this is the remote server or the remote cluster, AKS C1 US-West, and this will take a moment to run. Now that that's run, we can do a kubectl get pods -a. Everything looks good there. We can do a Cilium status, and we can see that everything looks good. Cluster mesh API servers up. Cluster Cilium operator. Cilium, everything looks good. So now we have the cluster mesh set up between the 2 AKS clusters across disparate availability zones. And that's it. Just like installing Cilium cluster mesh inside of an on-prem data center like I did in my previous video, which I'll link above, installing the cluster mesh inside of AKS across 2 availability zones is just that simple. Now there's many things that you can do with this, and there's many use cases for Cilium, which I cover in my other video, and I encourage you to go ahead and watch. But until next time, let me know what you think about this content. And if you're enjoying this content around Cilium and Kubernetes, please consider subscribing to my channel, smashing that like button, and leaving a comment below. I look forward to seeing you next time.